السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. هي مرام سوسلي الناشطة السياسية والنشطة على منصات التواصل الاجتماعي، حيث دأبت منذ انطلاق شرارة الحرب الكونية على سوريا على نشر مقاطع فيديو على طريقة المونولوج أو المناجاة الفردية التي تدافع فيها عن الرئيس السوري بشار الأسد وتفند فيها المفاهيم الغربية المغلوطة للحرب وتستشرف مستقبل البلاد وبعض الأحداث فيها، وذلك استنادا إلى قراءتها الجيوسياسية. مرام التي باتت تعرف بالفتاة السورية أو The Syrian Girl في مجتمع الصحفيين والمدونين الدوليين، مثلت حالة استثنائية منذ اندلاع الحرب على مسقط رأسها سوريا. هذه المدونة الشابة تستعرض الأحداث من دون زخرفة، بل إنها قدمت عدة وثائق رسمية تثبت صدقية ما ترمي إليه. ولعل السؤال الحقيقي ليس هو لماذا قد تكون مرام سوسلي مخطئة، بل لماذا كانت حجاجها جذابة ودقيقة للغاية بالنسبة إلى الكثيرين ومنهم المخضرمون في الحقل العلمي والإعلامي. يبدو السبب ببساطة أن منطقها يولد من رحم منطق المنطقة البائس، وتميزها بأسلوب وسردية للأحداث والتطورات أكسبها شهرتها في وسائل التواصل الاجتماعي باللغة الإنجليزية. تعالوا نتعرف أكثر إلى مرام سوسلي السورية-استرالية، الكاتبة وصانعة المحتوى والناشطة المثيرة للجدل والمدافعة الشرسة عن سوريا ورئيسها وأهلها وأرضها. ولعلنا نتطرق إلى مواضيع في صلب اهتماماتها وكتاباتها. أهلا بكم إلى حلقة جديدة من الداخل. معكم زينب صفار، تابعونا.
The fact is, it is the American and NATO governments and Israel that are funding these Al-Qaeda terrorists and Muslim Brotherhood extremists, and that is the point that everybody here is missing.
مرام Sousli, also known as the Syrian Girl or the Partisan Girl, Syrian-Australian chemist by study and training, and also political analyst / commentator, writer / content creator, joining us from Perth, West Australia. Welcome to الداخل from the inside, Maram.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here.
Pure pleasure to have you, dear. Well, you are an outspoken advocate of the Syrian government since you became active on social media platforms in 2012. You have refused to acknowledge that President Bashar al-Assad deployed chemical weapons against his own people, and this was supported by Ted Postel, a distinguished MIT professor and public intellectual. In 2012, you warned of chemical attack, false flag, before it occurred and predicted second US attack and invasion. You have had a certain prognosis as to how things would turn in Syria and West Asia. What prompted you, Maram, at the beginning of the war to pursue this path? What was it based on, and why have you decided steadfastly to take the side of the government in Syria?
Well, I started entering activism long before the war in Syria. In fact, it was post 9/11, and even a little bit before that, that I was part of the pro-Palestine movement. Then post 9/11, even as a kid, basically, I would protest against the war in Afghanistan and then the war in Iraq. I was very much in the anti-war movement, and that experience shaped me, and I sort of got a read of how things work, how the media works, how they lie, and all of the stuff with the WMDs and the chemical weapons of Saddam Hussein that turned out to be lies by the United States. I knew what their tricks were. So when the war began in my own country, Syria, I was very rather prepared for all the propaganda that we were going to see on TV. And I also knew that from the very beginning, the objective that the Americans had was to get rid of Syria's chemical weapons. And the signs were clear to me that they were going to set up some kind of chemical weapons false flag attack in order to excuse getting rid of Syrian chemical weapons so that they can invade. Because the only way the US has ever been able to invade a country is if they first disarm them of their deterrent weapons.
Maram, you said that you are an anti-war activist, yet you are supportive to certain kind of organizations and resistance movements that are armed to the teeth.
Absolutely. I am an anti-war activist. That doesn't make me a pacifist. I don't think that people should lay down and accept defeat or death. I think that people have a right to defend themselves, and I support every movement that is defending themselves against a illegal invasion and occupation, against terrorists like the Zionist entity and the US imperial machine that has destroyed country after country after country. I support people's right to resist. If that is violent, then so be it.
Right. Well, Maram, your professional style and narrative, and apparently your young, smart, telegenic look brought you fame and a large swathe of diversified followers and subscribers on various social media platforms. Yet your detractors believe that conspiracies lie at the heart of your worldview. Tell us more.
Well, it's ironic that these same people seem to deny any kind of conspiracy against the Syrian country and its allies. I mean, it's plain to see how many times these people have lied, and yet we're supposed to, they throw this word around, conspiracy theory, as a way to try to make people look like they're crazy. So if we don't believe their lies, apparently that makes us crazy. We should continue to believe that that Saddam has WMDs. Otherwise, we're conspiracy theorists. Essentially, that's what they're telling us. It's a very hollow term. In fact, the CIA invented it in the 70s just to tear down detractors. It's like the term anti-Semite. It's something that's thrown around all the time. There is no question that there has been a conspiracy against the Syrian state and its allies. This conspiracy was written about by the very think tanks of the US imperial machine. So they can call me whatever they want, but the fact is that I'm not going to support their sinister attempts to destroy my country by supporting terrorists. And that is exactly what they did, and there's mounds of evidence to support that.
Right. Maram, let's highlight a bit the bizarre new policy of censoring political discourse around violent events, quote unquote, like what is happening in occupied Palestine. And one might argue the hypocrisy of how certain social media platforms selectively implement their rules. And what would be the solution to this censorship?
Well, I think it's undeniable that the Israeli state, the Jewish state in the Levant, is out to commit genocide against anyone who isn't a Jew in the region. And unfortunately, because of this Zionism, any country that stands in the way of that genocide is, they attempt to destroy it. That was the purpose of the war in Syria. And it's become obviously clear to everyone that the intention of Israel is to commit genocide against Palestinians, ethnically cleanse them. And yet, you're allowed to deny this on social media. However, you're not allowed to deny other violent events, like basically any claim that the US State Department makes against China.
Other so-called violent events. As
other so-called violent events.
Can you tell us more in this sense? So long as it
supports the State Department narrative. Sorry.
Can you tell us more in this sense?
Yes, so long as this so-called violent event supports the State Department's narrative, for example, the so-called Uyghur genocide in Xinjiang province in China, I was censored for saying there's no evidence that any of that is happening, and there's not a single photograph I've seen, not a bomb drop, not a mass grave or anything like that. But I was censored off Twitter for a while for denying this, and yet you can deny the genocide against Palestinians all day long, and that just highlights how much censorship and control there has been in the internet, because the narrative has been controlled so much by the mainstream media, especially during the Iraq war and even during the war in Libya. It really was the war in Syria where the independent media on the internet was able to stand up against a lot of the lies of the mainstream media. And I think as a result of that, I and many others experienced a lot of censorship by Twitter, Facebook, other social media, YouTube, because we opposed successfully those lies by the mainstream media.
Right. Allow us, Maram, Sosli, to stop now for a short break, and afterwards we will continue to talk about the biased and censored control of the media. We'll talk about China, Afghanistan, but after the break. فاصل قصير ونعود، لا تذهبوا بعيدا. أهلا بكم من جديد. مرام سوسلي, Syrian girl and also the partisan girl, political commentator and analyst. Welcome back, Maram. Well, from where you are, Maram, in Perth, West Australia today, after more than 10 years to the conflict and the global aggression orchestrated to devastate Syria as a whole and the systematic agenda of its cultural genocide and to topple its president, also the ardent plans to balkanize the country. Today, how do you see Syria?
I think we are not yet victorious. I know a lot of people are now saying Assad has won, the Syrian government's won, the war is over. I see this war as it's still going and probably will be for a couple of years longer. The US is occupying the oil fields. They're preventing Syrians from being able to use their own fuel and their own food. Al-Qaeda is still controlling Idlib province. Turkey is still occupying the north as well. The US is still attempting to balkanize Syria and create a Kurdistan. However, I think that victory is going to happen. It's going to take a while, but I see in my prediction, and my predictions have been correct in the past, that victory is assured. It's just going to take some time.
Hopefully not so long. Well, the media has been selective and biased with its reporting vis-a-vis the war against Syria. Quote, a victory for the truth, unquote, was how the apology from the BBC over its coverage of the alleged chemical attack in the Syrian city of Douma was welcomed by the right-wing British tabloid newspaper, the Daily Mail. Yet the state broadcaster, the BBC itself, barely mentioned the news of their admission that its coverage of the incident was seriously flawed. Also, none of the major British newspapers gave it column space despite the serious nature of the matter. To what extent, Maram, has this cast doubt over the credibility of their respective coverage of the war on Syria?
I mean, if you don't doubt it already before this apology, then really you should question your insanity, because they've been lying incessantly since during every single war, and Syria has been no exception. It's interesting that the BBC, their lies were so obvious that they had to take them back, because there was a possibility that they were going to be sued for defamation based on those lies by the whistleblowers of the OPCW. So there were people inside the OPCW that thought that they were being politically pushed into saying that there was a chemical attack in 2018 in Douma, when they themselves see no evidence to support that. Of course, the US actually bombed Syria based on those lies. And the BBC was trying to tarnish the reputation of those scientists that came out and whistleblew against the OPCW. It's obvious the agenda here of the UK government and its media arm, the state-run BBC, was just attempting to justify their war against Syria, their continuation of that war, and the continued sanctions against the country so that it cannot rebuild. It's very sinister, and the lies about chemical weapons and the attacks, people probably won't remember that the very first chemical attack that occurred in Syria actually occurred against a government-held area in Aleppo 6 months before the attack in Damascus. So nobody remembers these little details because the media doesn't talk about them.
Because they are trying to build another narrative. Well, to stay in the region, Maram, Israel seeks to replace the US with China after the Afghanistan withdrawal. You have written about that. Tell us more about the Israel-China relationship in the past and today. And do you reckon that Israel's gamble might pay off?
I think that for the resistance axis, Syria, Iran, Lebanon, Hezbollah, they should be very, very aware of Israel's relationship towards China, because Israelis, they don't like to put all their eggs in one basket. Yes, the Zionist lobby has a lot of control over US politics, but at the same time, the Israelis have been trying to make inroads and establish relationships with China since the 80s by giving them stolen US military technology. And whilst, China has been supportive of the Palestinian cause, they've also since made a deal with Israel for a port in Haifa for the next 30 years. So I think at least the resistance axis needs to be aware of the possibility that Israel will act as a spoiler in the future Belt and Road Initiative or between Israel and China, and to make sure that this doesn't take place. I think that this is a legitimate strategy that Israel will try to pursue, and I think they will be successful because the Americans haven't been able to stop them from making that relationship with China because they don't have enough influence inside Israel, ironically, in order to do that. However, this might change in future if there's more upheaval inside the United States.
Right, but the Chinese have made also a long-term alliance and plan, for example, a roadmap plan with the Iranians in this regard.
That's absolutely true, and I think that China is taking the road of being neutral, somewhat neutral about political affairs. I mean, they were very supportive of the Palestinian struggle in the last war in bombing of Gaza. But I think that the problem is that while this is great, and I can definitely see some deals in fact being made with Iran and China. Recently there were meetings as well as with Syria, like the hope is that China will help rebuild Syria as well. The problem is that Israel might try to use its influence and gain traction inside China to break up that relationship. And I think this is the most important thing for the resistance axis to be aware of and try to prevent.
Right. What we've just witnessed in Afghanistan is a historical recurrence of the Saigon moment, quote unquote. Might you reflect on the past 20 years and consider how it was that those false humanitarian narratives led us to this point, Maram?
Absolutely. It's crazy to see the last 20 years I witnessed. I was also against the war in Afghanistan when it began, and I was telling everyone that it's going to be a 10-year war. It turned out to be a 20-year war. It started off with the claim that they were fighting terrorism and Al-Qaeda, and of course they put Al-Qaeda there in the first place. They admit this, and it was really more so about the opium and control of that Central Asian country, and the strategic depth that would gain them from that control. Because by creating instability in Afghanistan, they prevented also China from being able to have a Belt and Road Initiative. And I think that is something that they are still going to try to do. That's the purpose of the Xinjiang province instability or destabilization, is to try to prevent the Belt and Road Initiative from crossing into Afghanistan. So my comments on the Saigon moment would be like, this was a Saigon moment on steroids, because even in Saigon, we never saw scenes of people falling out of planes and being shot. One of the things that wasn't really talked about much in the media is that the US soldiers at the airport shot those civilians. So the bombing, the ISIS bombing that killed 170 people, most of those civilians were actually shot by American soldiers, and these people were actually going to the Americans for help to try to escape. I think there's a lesson here for anyone that thinks that they can collaborate with the US, that it's not going to end well for you if you trust them, and it's a valuable lesson.
Right.
Even Henry Kissinger said that to go against the US is dangerous, but to be allied to them is fatal.
Right, very well said, Maram. And that makes it for this edition with Maram Sousli, political analyst and commentator, digital content creator and writer, anti-war / pro-Palestine activist. We hope you will keep on throwing a light into dark places, Maram. Thank you very much for joining us from Perth, West Australia.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Always a pleasure to have you. ودائما الشكر لكم مشاهدينا الكرام على طيب المتابعة. للتفاعل أكثر تابعونا على صفحات السوشيال ميديا، وحتى نلتقي من كل فريق عمل من الداخل من كل الميادين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.